Recording in progress.
Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, faculty, your students. On behalf of Johns Hopkins SAIS, I would like to welcome you to the presentation and panel discussion of the 2024 Conflict Management Study Trip report titled Kenya, Good Governance as a Form of Peacebuilding. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sinisa Vukovic, and I'm the Senior Lecturer of Conflict Management and Global Policy here at SAIS, and also the Director of the Global Policy Program. As part of my teaching and mentoring responsibilities, I've been tasked to lead an annual conflict management trip designed as a capstone level course through which students get a rare opportunity to study a particular conflict-affected society using the analytical tools of conflict management as their baseline. So the trip to Kenya is the 21st installment of conflict management field trips to this date. And I think that's a remarkable success when it comes to these types of trips. In the past, students have studied a range of interstate and intrastate conflicts, all at different stages of their escalatory potential. Just to name a few, we've studied the conflict dynamics in Haiti twice. We went to Kosovo twice. We also went to Mindanao in the Philippines twice. Colombia was visited also twice. And on different occasions, we went to Northern Ireland, Casamance, Senegal, Sri Lanka, South Korea, Tunisia, Cyprus, Ethiopia, Ukraine. We visited also Israel and Palestine, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Nagorno-Karabakh, and El Salvador last year. This year, we chose Kenya. Each one of these trips yielded a comprehensive report, which is available online. And today you're going to hear the newest installment of this report. These reports represent an edited volume consisting of timely and thought-provoking analysis of ongoing conflicts by students who aspire to enter the vibrant field of conflict resolution and peacemaking. In the past, for many of our students, this was an opportunity to study a situation as it unfolds from up close, and it was a true turning point for them, a pivotal moment that propelled them into careers that allowed them to deal with such issues as part of their professional calling. I hope that some of them are actually on Zoom with us today and that they can witness the success of this year's group. As you could already deduce from the list of countries that I mentioned, our analysis has primarily focused on a set of fairly clear assumptions. Some situations, depending on the location, were studied through the lenses of peacemaking, negotiation, or mediation. Others through peace building.
Waiting room.
There's still more waiting room. Some of them were studied through the lenses of different elements of peace building or reconciliation, some through the notions of preventive diplomacy. Yet all of these conflicts had one thing in common. They were armed conflicts with very clear conflicting parties who promote and defend a very specific set of political agendas. They also had a very clear external component to them, either through mediation or through implementation assistance. So this year, we radically changed pace. We decided to expand the way we look at conflict management. We decided to explore if and how countries can resort to their own devices and mitigate specific dynamics with high escalatory potential. To that end, Kenya provided an unprecedented opportunity to study how a society that is poised with countless pressure points manages to handle all of them, all these stressors on its own. Issues such as electoral violence, climate shocks, terrorism, socioeconomic marginalization, and more have been at the forefront of academic research and policy planning. Yet to this date, we have lacked a comprehensive study that will look at all of these processes as they converge onto a single governance system, putting it under remarkable pressure to answer on a range of demands in an effective manner. Our students were tasked to see if such policies of good governance can translate into effective tools of long-term peace building. We decided to study Kenya up close without trying to force any form of analytical or policy assumption from other contexts into it. We tried to learn from the ongoing socio-political dynamics in Kenya how decisions are made, what informs these decisions, what are the trajectories that can be observed on the ground, and how different stakeholders prioritize their policy choices. To that end, as you know, in the third week of March, while most of the students were on spring break, enjoying a rightfully deserved break, these students traveled to Kenya for an incredibly high-paced study trip. In preparation for our trip, we were incredibly fortunate to have had support from lead experts on Kenya, both in DC area and abroad. They selflessly provided guest talks, meeting our needs and addressing all of the research goals in a superbly insightful manner. I would like to thank them all again for being an instrumental part of their project and thanking some of them for joining this event. While in Kenya, we were also fortunate and honored to have had an unprecedented access to stakeholders ranging from governmental officials, leading civil society organizations, human rights activists, academic community, diplomatic representation from the United States and Europe, the UN system, key experts in the country, and many more. Each of our meeting was conducted based on Chatham House rules, basically for non-attribution purposes. Each meeting, I may say that, was incredibly insightful and enriching. Each of our interlocutor provided a wealth of insights and viewpoints, frequently at odds with other perspectives, adding to the richness of our study. Our approach was never to take sides, advocate for any specific policy, or press on any specific normative claim. We were keen on embracing a multi-perspective approach and scrutinize the diversity of ideas and policy goals that were exposed throughout the trip. As you will see from the presentations that will follow, based on our preparations and the trip, the students have tried to cast a very wide net and offer one of the most comprehensive studies of the situation at hand to this date. The ambition, please note, is not to preach politics nor forecast the future. Equally, the goal is not to pretend that this is an exhaustive study that ends all discussions. On the contrary, this is an attempt by a group of students that are ambitious, driven, and very well informed to join the debate and offer a viewpoint that may be of use for those observing Kenya in situations of similar complexity. The report, as we like to refer to it, or potentially an edited volume, will consist of 16 individual studies of different topics that cover themes such as peace building in good governance writ large. For the purposes of expediency, 16 is a lot, we have invited 4 students to act as spokespersons for their respective groups that will reflect shared thread across 4 individual papers. So the way we're going to proceed is that we will have about 45 minutes to an hour for presentations for these 4 groups, following with a Q&A on all papers that are going to be presented. Authors will be called to answer whenever a question is directed towards their work. Please note that this is a capstone level project. This is a moment for our students to shine and prove to everyone that they have a lot to say and give to the vibrant and growing conflict management expert community. So now, before I yield the floor to our presenters, I would really like to express my utmost gratitude to Angel Chica, whose hard work, perseverance, discipline, and professionalism has made this study trip an absolute success. Thank you very much, Angel, for everything you have done for the past 6 months. Also, thank my students for their amazingly commendable performance throughout the course, their diligence and hard work, specifically in meeting the deadlines that were very short and very high-paced, their analytical curiosity and rigor. All students embrace a rare opportunity for a high-paced experiential course and delivered a final product that makes us all proud. You are all a true example of what sets SAIS apart from everyone that aspires to be our competition. Yet we are the only ones that can proudly showcase such a capstone level product of publishable quality, I may say, that in the years to come will remain and reaffirm your brilliant work as graduate students. Thank you all for making this experience memorable and setting a high bar for the generations to come. With this in mind, please allow me once again to thank you all for joining us today. It is a great honor to have you with us at SAIS. I'd like to invite the first group that will present the topic of security, good governance, and in security and good governance in Kenya, and their designated spokesperson, Zainabu Darbo.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zainabu Darbo, and I am going to be presenting for the security group. In our group, we also have Tali, and Jessica, and Danielle. And our broad topic is on security and good governance, and we have our different subtopics, which I will be going into. So our different subtopics that are covered in this research. First, we have the relationship between ethnic differentiation, also tribalism, and violent extremism in Kenya. And the second one, and this one is Tali's topic. The second one is violence, extremism, religion, and the politics of marginalization in Kenya. And this is Jessica's topic. The third one is Al-Shabaab terrorism and the securitization of Kenya's refugee laws, which is my topic. And the fourth one is women's recruitment into terrorist groups and the voluntary or involuntary spectrum for women, which is Danielle's topic. And then we're going to conclude with some recommendations from all of our subtopics on best good governance practices. So first, to give you some background on what we're going to be talking about and the areas that we're going to be talking about. So the graph on my left, and I think you guys is right, is on the religious breakdown in Kenya. And then the graph on the left is on ethnic groups, but also shows like regional areas. So specifically, the yellow and the orange areas is where we're going, most of our case studies are, and these are the northern and the coastal areas in Kenya. They are also the regions that suffer most from violent extremism and terrorist attacks. And they are also regions where most civilians feel marginalized by the country and communities. So the communities over there are mainly ethnic Somali Muslim communities. Okay, so going into the first topic, Toli's topic, which talks about the intersection of ethnic distribution and terrorism in Kenya. His topic talks about the linkages between ethnic differentiation and marginalization and the prominence of violent extremism. His research questions are broken down into two. First, we have how does ethnic differentiation contribute to the escalation of conflict and terrorism in Kenya? And the second research question is what are potential remedies for long-standing regional ethnic or tribal conflict. So his main findings are broken down into three categories. So we have first, ethnic differentiation and the resulting economic and political marginalization does have sizable impact on the incidence of violent extremism in Kenya. So what he really wants to drive here is that ethnic differentiation does play a role in violent extremism. However, this is not the main factor, and that it has to be accompanied with other structural factors such as economics and inequality. For it to really have the sizable impact that it does. So, for example, distribution of resources are inequitable. If you look at the northern areas, which I showed in the map, there's an inequitable distribution of wealth and resources. And as a result, these areas feel mainly marginalized. And because of that, they're more prompted or inclined or at risk of being involved in violent extremist groups. Which kind of leads into his second findings, which is that the socioeconomic grievances tied to regional and ethnic divisions that are more prominent in setting the conditions for radicalization. So if you combine ethnic and regional divisions or differentiations with economic factors, okay, yeah. So if you combine the ethnic and the regional differentiations with the economic factors, this is the main driver for violent extremism and people being involved in violent extremist organizations. So his last finding mainly has to do with recommendations for good governance, which is that improved mechanisms of good governance are the most suitable methods of addressing persisting regional and ethnic inequities and stemming violent extremism movement in Kenya. So in this finding or in this recommendation, what he really wants to drive is the fact that good governance should be inclusive and equitable. So the areas, the northern and the coastal areas who feel marginalized need to be involved in the government process, and also the structural issues that lead to their involvement in violent extremist groups, example, economic grievances, and marginalization need to be addressed for PVE, which is violent extremist work, to really, prevention of violence extremism to really work. Okay, so our second subtopic, region and the Republic, how Kenya addresses violent extremism. This is Jessica's topic. Her topic links violent extremism, religion, and politics of marginalization in Kenya. Her research topics are broken down into two. First, when a Christian majority country focuses on combating acts of terrorism that are rooted in a religious, in this case, Islamist ideology, what domestic conflicts emerge for the Muslim minority populations in that country. The second question is, how can that religious minority population work with a potentially antagonistic government on mitigating conflicts when a religious militant group, in this case, Al-Shabaab, acts as a spoiler in the peace-building process? Our main findings are broken down into three. The first finding is that major attacks conducted by Al-Shabaab resulted in the national government's hard approach strategy, which marginalized the Muslim and ethnic Somali communities. So specifically, if we look at the aftermath of the Westgate Mall attack, which was in 2013, and the Garissa University attack, which was in 2015, immediately after these attacks, the government took a hard approach to ethnic Somali and Muslim communities, and this involves monitoring their communities, mass arrests of youths suspected of being involved in terrorism, and the mass arrest also goes with, a lot of the times the youths that are arrested are not, there's not strong enough evidence to prove that they have actually been involved in terrorist activity, but they just arrested because of suspicions. So all of those aspects of marginalization came out of these terrorist attacks, in that these communities were directly linked to those attacks. So the second finding is that a shift away from hard approaches began after Garissa University attack, and this is due to domestic and international pressures. So after Garissa, we saw a shift from the hard approach into softer approaches, which was done through the National Strategy for Countering Violent Extremism, which I will be referring to as NSVE in this presentation. This was launched in 2016, and this represented a shift from the previous hard approaches, in that there are now localized mechanisms or systems for dealing with PVE work. So for example, as previously, it used to be the national government that was involved in PVE work, but now they do it through county government. So part of NSCV is that every county needs to have county action plans. And these county action plans involve working with different NGOs, working with civil society groups, and working with faith-based organizations. And each county does it based on what grievances their county has, and what kind of triggers or risks that they have for their youth being involved in violence extremist groups. And she concluded that this was a form of, or a step towards having good governance and a shift from a hard to a soft approach. Which kind of also leads into her last finding, which is that religion and religious leaders are deeply interwoven into both the NSCVE and county action plans. So the case study that she kind of used for this that shows successes with regards to NSCVE is the Isiolo County and the Interfaith Network, which deals with PVE work, mainly through counseling, providing mentoring, providing employment opportunities, using youth activities. So community and grassroots work that is not hardly securitized, but really engaging with the community. And it mainly focuses on preventing aspects instead of counterterrorism. So thirdly, we get to my topic, which is terrorism, humanitarianism, and national security, the Kenya case. My topic basically deals with Al-Shabaab terrorism and the securitization of Kenya's refugee laws. My main research question is that how does Kenya's national security concern of Al-Shabaab terrorism inform its policies on refugee rights? My tentative argument or hypothesis is that due to its concern of Al-Shabaab terrorists, the Al-Shabaab terrorist threat, Kenya's refugee laws are an instrument of national security rather than refugee rights protection. And I have four main findings. First is that there is a direct link between securitization of Kenya's refugee laws and al-Shabaab terrorism. And I came to this conclusion by comparing Kenya's refugee laws before the 1990s and after the 1990s, in the early 2000s and now. So I found that in the early 1990s, Kenya had an open door policy for immigration, and that immigrants were welcomed and they were integrated into both Kenyan social society and also into the economic system. And at the time, the immigrant population was very small, consisting mainly of Ugandans who were mainly there for employment opportunities. The shift started in the 1990s with the influx of mass refugees, mainly from, sorry, I just saw someone get out. The shift started in the 1990s with regional instability. So we saw that there was a civil war in Somalia at that time, and there was a civil war in Sudan at that time too. So a lot of refugees started coming into Kenya. And at this time, there was a gradual shift towards securitization, but securitization really came into place in the early 2000s when al-Shabaab terrorism became prominent. And in this time, we saw there was a shift into encampment, whereas before refugees were allowed to be integrated into the economic system and could live freely in Kenyan society. Now they were tied into camps. And also, as al-Shabaab terrorism became prominent in Kenya, refugee laws became tied into counterterrorism. So that was the main finding for that one. And then for the second one, we have securitization follows a top-down model in Kenya. So whereas in other countries, it is, securitization comes from the bottom in the sense that when refugees come in, there's a sense of insecurity among the populations with indifferences, and this pushed down to the top, to the government, where it is securitized. In the Kenya case, securitization comes from the government in that the government links specific ethnic groups. Here, we're talking about Somali ethnic groups and also refugees to terrorism and to instability in Kenya. So thirdly, we have desecuritization. Thirdly, we have securitization is used as a scapegoat for civilian discontent with the government. So in this case, Kenya experiences a lot of economic issues, and these economic issues are tied with climate change, which has exacerbated the issues. And then in addition to that, because of prominent al-Shabaab attacks, there's a level of insecurity that civilians feel. But at the same time, the government's responses, especially when it came to the Garissa attack of 2015, a lot of civilians felt that the government did not respond to those attacks appropriately and did not take the appropriate measures to really protect the civilians in that case. So because of all of these grievances, the government uses securitization, attaching ethnic Somali Kenyans and also Somali refugees into instability as a scapegoat from all of the civilian discontents. And lastly, we have desecuritization through the national strategy for countering violent extremism. This is very similar to what I discussed in regards to Jessica's. So I saw that there is Kenya's refugee laws are highly still securitized. However, there is a shift with the passage of NSCVE to more softer approaches. And we see this desecuritization in two aspects of NSCVE: decentralization, which is now decentralizing PVE work to county level governments, and also the integration of non-state actors, so specifically civilian societies, NGOs, and faith-based organizations. And I also had the same case study for showing successes of decentralization and integration of non-state actors, which is the Isiolo County with their interfaith network, where they have successfully not only decreased radicalization in their county, but also have successfully rehabilitated formerly radicalized youth. So finally, with our fourth topic, we have women's involvement in al-Shabaab, which is Danielle's topic. Her topic focuses on the linkages between grievances and why women join al-Shabaab. Her research questions are two. First, we have, how do grievances propel women to join al-Shabaab voluntarily, and how is this voluntary recruitment motivated by societal constraints? And secondly, we have, how does government in Kenya interact with women's voluntary recruitment, and what can be done to mitigate this problem? So she has three main findings. First, we have governance strategies must account for the distinction between voluntary and involuntary recruitment into Al-Shabaab. So what she really wants to drive for this point is that even in cases where women join Al-Shabaab voluntarily, it is because they join due to structural constraints. So lack of employment, poverty, patriarchy, and lack of opportunities. So on the outside, it seems that they join involuntarily, but it is heavily influenced by these structural constraints that they have. So for good governance for there to be good governance in PVE work, this aspect must be recognized and addressed. Her second finding is that women's roles within Al-Shabaab are relegated to subordinate positions that reinforce gender inequalities and limit agency. So the three roles that she highlights that women occupy in Al-Shabaab. First, we have recruitment, and even in this role, they still use their social networks and grievances around women's roles in society, traditional women's roles in society, and their ability to navigate into certain spaces that other people men would not be able to get into, to try to recruit more women to get into the organization. And also they use similar strategies when it comes to intel gathering. So using their social networks and also their ability to get into different spaces to gather intel for the organizations. And also with regards to suicide bombers, this both challenges traditional norms of gender roles, but also shows how women can be exploited in terrorist organizations. Because now, although this is not very prominent, women are being used as suicide bombers in terrorist organizations such as Al-Shabaab. And lastly, what she wants to point out is that effective PVE strategies must address the root causes of women's marginalization. So the structural issues that I talked about in the beginning on how even in cases where women voluntarily join these terrorist organizations, it is because they have structural and societal constraints that propel them to do it. So in order for good governance on PVE to be successful, these issues must be addressed in the sense that there needs to be inclusive, gender-sensitive governance, education, employment opportunities, and political representation for women. So to kind of conclude everything together and some suggestions that we have around good governance, in all of our 4 subtopics, the main finding that we have is that structural imbalances are the root cause of violent extremism. So either it comes to refugees or with regards to ethnicity or with regards to religion or women's structural imbalances are the root cause of these issues. And secondly, we found that PVE and CVE should be comprehensive. Well, we want to recommend that PVE and CVE should be comprehensive and inclusive. So there should be a gender dynamic to it that recognizes the risk or the reasons why women join the organizations. And also there should not be a heavy reliance or a heavy consideration of religion and tribe and ethnicity, because as we have seen, yes, these things do play a role or play a factor, but they are compounded or are mainly driven by economic factors. And also with regards to localization, members of these communities need to be involved in the political processes for there to be successful good governance or PVE and CVE work. So lastly, we recognize that NSCVE is a good start theoretically. However, there needs to be specific implementation mechanisms that need to be addressed for it to really work. And this is appropriate government support, first financially. So a lot of the counties lack the financial ability or the financial support to be able to really carry out their mandates or the county action plans that they have, and also capacity building. They also don't have the capacity to be able to do a lot of this PVE work. So the government really needs to support both the counties and also the non-state actors, the NGOs and the faith-based organizations who have already shown that they are having some success, but these successes can be compounded if they get enough support from the government. And lastly, the main liaison between these county action plans and the non-state actors and the government is the National Center for Counterterrorism, which is NCTC. However, this is one agency that has to deal with all of the numerous counties in Kenya and all of the numerous non-state actors and civil society organizations that are all doing PVE work. So it needs to be more, spread out. A lot of other agencies and actors need to be involved in it as opposed to one agency being involved in it. But yeah, those are our main recommendations and conclusions, and thank you so much for it.
Starting on a very high note, thank you very much. Be tough to follow. I would like to now introduce our second topic, which is going to be on the political issues in the country. And as the comprehensive title suggests, there are multiple issues that are going to be covered.
Horrible title. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm excited to present here kind of our hybrid connection between constitutional design, conflict, good governance, inclusivity, a lot of really overlapping themes in a post-conflict setting. Kenya is one of the strongest democracies in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not a coincidence that happened, and it's not a very old democracy. So I want to go into some of the ways in which they've fortified the democratic institutions and governance within the country, and while noting as well how much they still have to do. So to start with some of the more structural issues facing the country and structural successes, Kenya was a British colony, British protectorate as well, and received its independence in 1963. It was a pretty standard post-independence or post-colonial constitution. It was negotiated by a lot of the folks leading Kenya at the time, as well as the British government. A year later, they started amending the constitution and start moving towards their own system of governance. This created a lot of instability for a new democracy, naturally. There was decades of political violence. There was a coup. There were hundreds of amendments to the Constitution. At one point, the Constitution was amended so that one-party rule at first was the de facto way of governing the country, and shortly after it became de jure one-party rule. Democracy was functionally non-existent in the country, despite having a constitution, despite having a democratic constitution. The words were not backed up by action. In recent years, however, after 1991, when this one-party rule was repealed, Kenya was able to start holding elections. They were not fair, they were often not free, but they were elections nonetheless. But it also came with violence as a result. Heavy political violence, especially in the 2000s. Hundreds of people dying every time that there's a federal election. Kenya has a winner-take-all presidential system. The country with between 40 and 70 ethnic groups has a winner-take-all majoritarian system. So 2010 comes along after another violent presidential election. There's finally an agreement. We should reform the systems and the institutions within the country to better reflect the diverse community and diverse population within the country. There's still a winner-take-all system to this day. Are there? Oh, thank you. But as Pierre just brought me my prop, our new constitution provides stronger civil rights, individual liberties, and devolution, which is perhaps one of the most important components of it. There are now 47 counties under the federal level that a significant amount of power has been moved to. This allows, in theory, for individuals from communities and from counties that don't have a large population, of one of the predominant ethnic groups, to still have a say in some level of government. This is really important in areas with also religious minorities. Over 80% of the country identifies as Christian, about 11% identifies as Muslim. It's important that everyone in the country, regardless of religious or ethnic background, has the same rights and liberties. And one thing I want to make emphasis here is that they did not create some type of threshold for ethnicity or religion in government. There's not this many seats going to this religion, this many seats going to this entity. The idea was that regardless of your individual beliefs, regardless of your identity, that you were afforded the same social, political, and constitutional rights. This is going to be an ongoing challenge, though, because responsibility is one thing. What's written in paper, what's written in this Constitution is one thing, but what happens is a different reality. And it's going to be incumbent upon civil society, upon the public, upon elected officials in the country to actually see through that what's written in this new Constitution plays out in reality. Moving on, this as part of this discussion on politics, on elections in Kenya, violence is intermingled with that, unfortunately. In these 3 presidential elections that Imran has mentioned, I mean, the demonstrations were widespread, centered mainly in the capital, Nairobi, but nonetheless widespread throughout the country. And let's be clear, it's not a matter of the public being discontent with the election that's fueling all of the violence. It's definitely part of it. But what was found was that politicians themselves, and this remains to the day, politicians themselves were instigating the violence as an electoral strategy. They found ways in which to basically say, this group of people is the reason you are not well off. You should not vote for them. You should vote for your kind, your people, your candidate. And unfortunately, the vestige of this is that to this day in presidential elections, as a winner-take-all system, it remains this issue of it being an overly ethnicized division. There have been 5 presidents of Kenya. They have come from 2 ethnic groups out of over 40 to 70, depending on what you're counting. This is not where we need to be as a country. The biggest change, however, positive change from 1992, first post one-party state elections to now, was that 2010 Constitution, because it added some level of accountability to politicians to say that if you instigate violence, you can be prosecuted. It's not always going to be the case. I mean, it takes decades of development, it takes commitment from the public and from civil society and from politicians themselves to support that, but it's the right direction. One of the biggest functional changes was the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. This is now an independent commission within the country that we had the pleasure of meeting with, and that runs the elections for the country. They redistrict, as they saw, delineate the lines of electoral districts. They ensure that everything's counted fairly. They are the functional administrators of the election. The idea was to remove it from the direct political array. But a notable component of this, all of the commissioners are appointed by the parliament, by politicians. And if they don't want accountability, they don't appoint commissioners. There are currently none. There are no commissioners on this commission. Therefore, the redistricting has been delayed, and there are serious concerns about the viability of successful upcoming elections because there is not a constitutional mandate to carry them out. So strengthening the IEBC is going to be one of the critical steps that Kenya takes in the coming years to be able to have continuously successful, free and fair elections, hopefully with a lower propensity for violence. One of the interesting trends within Kenyan society in the last few years has been an urbanization of the politics and urbanization of society. When we talk about these type of case studies on conflict management, it's no longer just a discussion of, oh, these abstract, different people, the only thing they're caring about are the risks of violence. Kenya is a modern democratic society as anywhere else in the world and has some of the same challenges that other countries have. Cost of living, it's a huge discussion in Kenya right now. But if you only look at conflict in a country like that, you miss that discussion. This is to say that there have been many cases in the last few years of people just moving for economic opportunity, cost of living, for access to jobs, access to resources. And you're going to have increasingly diverse communities. Nairobi, which is one of obviously the most diverse city in the country, has a very large population of ethnic Somali Kenyan citizens. This is just because people are looking for opportunity, looking for work, looking to move. So what drives this urban violence is not these drivers of urban violence are not going to be addressed by devolution alone. Devolution, allowing these 47 counties to govern themselves in some way, is not going to get these communities to where they need to be in terms of being truly inclusive, truly open, and truly collaborative of everyone who's living inside them. Some of these ongoing issues with urban violence, especially in Nairobi, Kenya's policing, we talk about all these systems that have been devolved and sent to the counties. Policing and law enforcement is not one of them. There's still a national police force. And there's an emphasis on having, local control, local collaboration. But by and large, it is governed at the national level. It is overly militarized and the pay is very low. So you're running into issues of corruption, ethnic violence, discrimination, and a lot of these ongoing issues that are really exacerbated in a highly urbanized, densely populated, and ethnically diverse area. This is not a region and not an example of how you could address discrimination or marginalization of an ethnicity when that is the only ethnicity living in one small community. You have to be truly collaborative. And one of the benefits of the Constitution is that, in theory, because those same rights are afforded to everyone, regardless of your ethnic or religious background, you should not have any structural discrimination stopping you from, receiving the services you need, the education you need, et cetera. But again, it's a very different story on paper and in reality. So empowering the judiciary to actually go after law enforcement or politicians that exacerbate this violence is crucial. There is no success in cracking down on abuses of law enforcement, abuse of politicians, abuse of the military without the accountability mechanism. It's responsibility versus accountability. You have to have both. If you only have one, then you don't have any success here. One of the benefits of one of the international operations that has addressed this, at least temporarily, there was an ICC investigation into former President Kenyatta and now incumbent President Ruto on this large-scale urban violence. And by showing politicians in the country that you can be held accountable for exacerbating these issues of violence, of discrimination, of marginalization, if that accountability mechanism is there and known, you are less likely to see these problems persist. One of the biggest challenges Kenya has experienced in the last few years is one of the largest refugee communities, populations in sub-Saharan Africa. There's been a significant amount of conflict and war and discrimination and marginalization happening in a wide number of countries, not just bordering Kenya, but throughout the entire region. And Kenya, as seen as a relatively stable, democratic, welcoming country over the last 15 or so years, has been a prime destination for many refugees. Many of them have been subjugated and put only into refugee camps. But one of the ongoing discussions has been how to properly integrate refugees into the communities that they're living in. It's not going to just be a matter of keeping camps safe, right? Because you can't keep everyone just sequestered into certain areas. And Kenya does not do that. But one of the ongoing challenges has been that the public perception of refugees remains markedly low. Seen as different, othering of society. There's been very little, there have been very few attempts to integrate them in really any meaningful way. One of the interesting things, again, in this discussion of devolution, which I think by now you're piecing together is a pretty big component of Kenyan governance, is that even if there is now an added attempt to have a bottom-up approach with refugee status, it still functionally comes from the top down. It still functionally has a problem where there are just directives on refugee rights and access to work and myriad of other issues coming from the national government, not with a local context, not with local considerations, and not with consideration for the type of refugees they may be coming from. Why are they in Kenya? What were they fleeing? What opportunities are going to be made available for them? And this creates an even greater division within the communities that these refugees live in, because their fate is functionally not handled by anyone around them. And conversely, the fate of the refugees, the locals feel like they have no say or control over, so it creates this extra hostility for the refugees. Kenya has sought to expand its role as a peacemaker for the region, works very closely with the US and the EU and other international stakeholders to prove it. The UN regional headquarters is in Nairobi. They are growing it year by year. More and more programs are being centered around there. As part of this, though, it's important that the issues in Kenya itself remain on the agenda, because there's a propensity to allow Kenya to focus on other countries and on other challenges in the region, including on refugees, including on ethnic and urban violence. All of these issues are much easier to look elsewhere than looking within. So it's going to be one of the ongoing challenges, especially with refugees, on ensuring that the ones in Kenya have access to the services and rights they need. So to come together between all of these, which I admit are a little bit of a hodgepodge, but all within a governance context, it's important that we are modernizing our electoral institutions of Kenya. So one of the key pieces is bringing the IEBC, the Independent Electoral Boundary Commission, which is currently subject to parliamentary votes and nominations and appointments, into the judiciary, which has a relatively high degree of trust amongst the public and also better insulates the commission from the day-to-day politics. Again, when we have a situation where politicians who don't want to have new electoral districts or don't want to worry about the fairness of elections can just choose not to fill the commission, then the benefits afforded to the IEBC in the Constitution are pointless because they cannot actually be carried out. Accountability matters a lot in Kenya and a lot for democratic development in the country. The judiciary has been one of the greatest successes of the constitutional reform of 2010, but it will only be as successful as it is afforded the independence, both financially and structurally. There's been an ongoing dispute over the peacekeeping mission to Haiti that President Ruto has proposed. Supreme Court blocked it under constitutional grounds, and the president has spoken out very harshly against the court, arguing that they don't have the mandate to do this, that they're overstepping their bounds, that they're attacking the security of Kenya. So one of the questions Kenya will have to ask in the coming weeks, months, and years is how long can they sustain those attacks from the public? How long will they tolerate those attacks on the independence of the judiciary? Because the judiciary, the separation of powers is what gives Kenya the structural success to be the international partner of the US, of the EU, of other organizations. If they don't have that, they will have nothing to show for it. Refugee communities need greater support. Simple as that. There need to be more resources provided to county governments. Most of the resources, financial resources of counties, come from the federal government as it is. They're given a certain percentage of tax revenue to carry out the missions that they're required to do. A discussion needs to be had over the role that counties can play in properly integrating refugees into the communities that they live. Broadly speaking, this societal collaboration that we want to emphasize, everyone's got to be more collaborative. Civil society, public stakeholders, local stakeholders, voters, institutions. This constitution has done a great job in writing of building a more inclusive and collaborative and strong liberal democracy. But as I've mentioned, it's going to take the commitment and sustained commitment to really see this through. And finally, because it's the word of the day for us, devolution. There's going to be ongoing disputes. This constitution is not even 15 years old. It's still working out who is supposed to be doing what, who has the responsibility on certain issues, and where's the accountability when those actions are not taken. So adhering to constitutionally mandated budgets, carrying them out in a timely manner, ensuring that the counties have the resources and the clear direction to carry out their mission is going to be one of the most essential pieces to the success of Kenyan democracy in the coming years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nick. So let's get to slide for you. We're gonna do the climate issues because there was a fluke. So the next group is going to talk about an exogenous set of factors. We about ask everyone to do. Leonard Miller is going to talk about on behalf of the climate shocks and peacebuilding.
Yes, thank you very much. We're going to discuss a bit climate and the environment in Kenya, and I'm presenting on behalf of Sylvia, Almaha, and Connor, who all also. And yeah, I think we have some quite exciting things to present. This group is dealing with the complex issue of climate change and conflict in Kenya. And Kenya has seen severe impacts of climate change with increasing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and more frequent and intense droughts, which are all exacerbating current and existing vulnerabilities, such as resource scarcity around the country, as well as an increased number of land disputes due to climate change. So the impacts of climate change and resulting conflicts are not felt equally in the country, with marginalized communities such as pastoralists or women that are both present in our research bearing a disproportionate impact and burden due to their reliance on natural resources and limited access to decision-making processes. So with this in mind, we have 4 research papers to present to you. I'll start to present my topic, which is on the intersection of pastoral communities, conflicts caused by climate change. Then we have Almaha discussing gendered climate conflicts. Sylvia focused on water insecurity and rebellion in Kenya. And then last but certainly not least, Connor discusses climate finance governments for peace building. And then we'll also have some joint recommendations towards the end. So let's start with pastoralist conflicts. And in my research, I really tried to look at, let's say, small conflicts, microcosm of conflicts, such as pastoralist communities conflicts in Kenya, and see how this could maybe be scaled up and seen on a more global issue, since we now see that climate change is becoming more intense all over the world. So how are maybe these small conflicts of marginalized communities that are hit first by climate change might be maybe an indicator of a very dark future that is coming upon us if climate change intensifies before it gets better. So how can maybe this study be seen not only between 2 communities, but between 2 cities, between nations? So a bit of a geopolitical aspect to it as well. But my research has a strong emphasis on pastoral conflicts in Kenya and the role of governance in addressing these issues. And my findings are threefold. First, climate change is a very strong environmental stressor, and it has a profound impact on Kenya and pastoral communities, multiplying existing challenges and disproportionately affecting marginalized communities like pastoralists who are so heavily dependent on the climate and natural resources. And they face acute challenges due to climate change, including recurring droughts, floods, cattle overstocking, and deforestation. And all of these climate-induced environmental changes exacerbate resource scarcity and competition, leading to conflicts such as cattle raids, land disputes, or violent clashes between pastoralists and agrarian communities, for example. And then there's a potential for climate-induced conflicts to be scaled up. I was trying to create a climate change impact model that heavily rests on the environmental scarcity theory, but I tried to add a few other factors such as socioeconomic factors into this model. And through this model, I do see that there's the potential to scale up these more extensive migration and conflicts driven by climate change that we see in Kenya right now, as the impact of climate change becomes more widespread and severe. And the scale of migration and conflict may increase, leading to larger scale conflicts between communities, ethnic groups, or then even nations. Almaha is then trying to take a bit more a gender perspective on conflict. And her research focused on the gender impacts of climate change and conflict in Kenya's pastoral communities. examining how environmental peace building can integrate gender perspectives to address these challenges a bit better and more sustainable than we've done so in the past, maybe. And her findings are fivefold. First, she also finds that climate change acts as a catalyst for conflict, acts as a threat multiplier for conflict, like I did in my research. And then she, surprise, surprise, also finds a disproportionate impact on pastoralist women due to their double marginalization, on the one hand based on gender and on the other hand on the pastoralist groups, which then leads to an increased exposure to violence, loss of livelihood, restricted mobility, and also exclusion from important decision-making processes. However, despite these challenges, pastoralist women have demonstrated in the past and currently resilience by engaging in economic activities, forming groups, and trying to diversify their income sources. However, also not surprising, their adaptation strategies are often hindered by structural challenges that are still present, such as limited financial literacy, leadership issues within communities, and inadequate access to resources. However, she does find how important it is to integrate women in peace building and environmental governance, as it not only addresses immediate conflict, but also contributes to long-term community resilience. And to achieve this, there's an extremely high pressing need for inclusive strategies that empower women and enhance their roles in leadership and decision-making processes around Kenya. She also notes the role of governments and NGOs to empower women economically and involve them in decision-making processes currently in Kenya. However, as well there, not as a surprise, challenges remain, particularly in financing and culturally sensitive practices. The third research that we like to present is from Sylvia, from Drought to Descent, how water insecurity and climate change fuels rebellion. And Sylvia is trying to find out, or is using Kenya as a case study to analyze the impact of good governance of adaptation initiatives on enhancing resilience to climate shocks and reducing conflicts. And good governance of public and private climate sorry, I went one slide ahead. She's examining the linkages between resource and water insecurity, climate change, and rebellion in the case of Kenya. I'm so sorry, Sylvia. And she's evaluating the role of resource governance in the management of the incentives for conflict and rebellion. And she finds that poor resource governance creates conditions that enable armed conflict and the emergence of non-state actors and non-state armed groups. And in Kenya, resource insecurity related rebellion has manifested itself in three primary forms. First, in northern pastoralist Kenya, cattle banditry and armed conflict between pastoralists and farmers have arisen due to competition over land and water resources, which I also strongly found in my first research looking at northern Kenya. Second, in northern and coastal Kenya, climate-related impoverishment has led to increased recruitment to the extremist group Al-Shabaab. And lastly, in Nairobi's urban slums, water cartels have emerged to control and distribute water resources in the absence of effective government provisions. So you can also see how in different areas of the Kenya, very different communities are already impacted by water insecurity. And it's not only the pastoralists far off somewhere in the countryside, but we also have cases in urban areas in the city right now. Now we move on to climate finance, the research that Connor worked down, from drought to descent, how water, no, that's again, I have climate finance for conflict reduction, lessons in governance from Kenya. And Connor is trying to use Kenya as a case study to analyze the impact of good governance of adaptation initiative to enhance resilience to climate shocks and reducing conflicts, and good governance of public and private climate adaptation finance as a mediating variable in reducing conflict and contributing to long-term peace building. So maybe a bit of a nuanced view how maybe finance can be used as a tool to bring peace to communities and to Kenya. And his findings are also fivefold. Kenya has made significant strides in incorporating governance principles into its climate adaptation initiatives through comprehensive laws and policy that exhibit transparency, accountability, human rights, leading to increased public funding for adaptation programs. Second, well-designed aid programs addressing the root causes of conflict and adaptation finance, reducing vulnerabilities, demonstrate synergies between adaptation and development in international aid efforts, with Kenya trying to align its development plan with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to ensure climate-sensitive financial flows. Third, private sector finance is absolutely crucial for supporting climate adaptation initiatives. And effective governance principles are essential for attracting private sector investments, with Kenya trying to actively work to leverage private finance through initiatives like a transparent and verifiable carbon credit market. Fourth, increasing public and private financial flows in Kenya are addressing key climate and conflict-related vulnerabilities, indicators such as water security and resource availability. And lastly, however, and also not as a surprise probably, improperly designed climate adaptation programs can exacerbate existing conflicts, as seen with certain conservation programs in northern counties, heightening tensions between farmers and herders, underscoring the need for improved governance of climate adaptation programs with a focus on long-term peace building. So I think you can see from the 4 researches that we have how, especially with climate change, from how many different angles we have to tackle this problem to bring peace to these communities. And we try to bring together 5 joint recommendations that you can probably find in all of our 5 papers. For a more detailed view, of course, feel free to read the full paper. First, and maybe one of the most important ones, inclusive and participatory governments. We've seen in Kenya, especially through talking to a lot of different stakeholders of society, one of the number one things that people try to share, good case practices and conversely as bad case practices, is that if not everyone in the community or some representative of certain communities of society have a fair representation in decision-making processes for resource management, for example, or climate adaptation and peace building, results are not that good. On the opposite side, if we see a very fair representation of stakeholders in communities, the results are quite good. So strengthen community-based organizations and civil society groups to foster dialogue and cooperation. Second, improved resource governance and equitable distribution. There also has to be a secure access to sufficient resources, especially water for all. Especially the case in Sylvia's case in the slums in Nairobi, equitable access to water for all is essential, since it kind of serves as the foundation as well to actually survive and to live. So ensure fair and equitable resource distribution across counties as well, fair across all the counties, and it needs more investment in infrastructure for clean water, sustainable energy, and safe transportation, also particularly for women and pastoralist people in Kenya. Third, then, climate smart adaptation measures and infrastructure development, heavy investment in water conservation, research and climate smart infrastructure to reflect climate change impacts and ensure development project and financial flows are climate sensitive and aligned with the UN SDG, which is the government already trying to do. Fourth, economic empowerment and alternative financing models. Ensure allocated funds for economic environment are used as intended through audits and public disclosure. Maybe also develop alternative financing models inclusive of cultural and religious beliefs, like Sharia-compliant products for the Muslim part of society, and trying to dismantle obstacles and implement policies to facilitate women participation in high-value sectors such as the beef industry. And last, but also certainly not least, also one of the most important ones, we've also heard this a lot throughout the trip, community-led bottom-up initiatives for peace-building efforts. So heavily invest in funds to promote community-led initiatives, resolving resource-based conflicts, leveraging traditional mechanism and involving elders, women, and especially also the youth. So with this, thank you very much. And yeah, we're looking forward to engaging in the conversation.
Last but not least, is going to be the group that deals specifically in a targeted way on a range of social issues. And as you will see, the topic that will emerge from all of the presentations is the importance of bottom-up approaches to peace building as a way to sustainability. Presenter Kofi Jo is going to talk on behalf of the group.
Karibu and Mariako. That's the only Swahili I know. My name is Jo Gefei Kofi. I'm gonna present the social issues of Kenya on behalf of Alessia, Krisha, Layang, and myself. So when I first visited Nairobi as a tourist, I was so surprised at how developed the city was. I saw so many fancy shopping malls, really nice highways, skyscrapers. So it's giving Texas instead of Africa. But the more I visited the country and the more I get to know about Kenya, I realized this is a country that is grappling with numerous social challenges, like the really high youth unemployment rate, and 60% of Nairobi's population lived in slums where the living conditions are the worst you can ever imagine. And 1 in every 5 women in Kenya has experienced female genital mutilation, which violated human rights. And when you walk on the street, you have to be really careful because the boda motorbike riders, which affiliated to criminal gangs, might snatch your phone. So this country has a lot of social challenges, and that is why we research 4 different topics. The first one is the young people, how to empowering youth for social and political inclusion. The second one is human security, health, and good governance. The third one is women's involvement in peace building initiatives in Kenya. And the last one is the political clientelism in Kenya, the evolution of organized criminal gangs in electoral violence. The first research, it's done by Alessia, Young People and the Future of Democracy in Kenya, Empowering Youth for Social and Political Inclusion. Her research question is, how can Kenya effectively achieve social inclusion and enhance political access for its youth population? Why is this research important? 70% of Kenya's population, it's young, but they are largely excluded from political roles, employment opportunities, and they cannot afford higher education. They have there's a notable increase in unsustainable student loans, and the unemployment rates are very high, which leaves room for those young people to be recruited into organized criminal gangs and Al-Shabaab. And violence among the youth in large informal settlements, it's very pervasive. So the main finding of Alessia's research is that there should be a new form of social inclusion and development of the youth achieved through 2 primary mechanisms. The first one is the top-down initiatives. So these are often led by international NGOs, agencies like the UN, the World Bank, or faith-based and secular organizations that implement programs such as the UN 2013 SDGs. Although these programs are generally directed by older individuals with extensive experience, they can foster social mobility when successfully integrated into the community. And a very good example, it's the US Young African Leaders Initiative that leveraged the Kenyan diaspora in America to increase the youth inclusion in Kenya. And the second mechanism is the bottom-up progression. So this is a grassroots approach that emerged spontaneously at the community level, particularly in urban peripheries, and involves economic and cultural self-organization and youth entrepreneurship. So these initiatives become more formalized once they gain recognition through media exposure and civil engagement. For example, there are some music and solidarity initiatives in the slums. And in other countries like Rwanda and Tanzania, the youth networking and in the national reconciliation process proved to be very effective. The second research is very niche and innovative. Krisha did her research on human security, health, and good governance in Kenya. Her research question is, what is the importance of a holistic good governance in peace building? It's health as a bridge for peace and effective diplomacy tactic. So the importance of the research lies in the fact that addressing inequality and marginalization can transform violence reduction and achieve positive health outcomes. So health as a bridge for peace was originally undertaken in Central America in the 1980s by the Pan-American Health Organizations as a track to diplomacy tactic. This approach is based on shared concerns around fundamental health issues. It provides an entry point in the process of negotiation because health issues transcend political, economic, social, and ethnic divisions among peoples and provides a nexus for dialogue at multiple levels. And it generally refers to the efforts by health-oriented organizations and health professionals designed to improve public health and contribute to promoting peace or reducing conflict. So Nairobi's slums experience a range of violence, including political, religious, resource-related, and gender-based violence. So the link between peace, development, and health, it's a direct one, as conflicts and violence impact health or can cause a disruption in social and economic system, leading to a decline in health. And the efficacy of the HBP initiative, it's not conclusive in Kenya, given the major gaps in the literature. However, there have been very small-scale community-based studies which highlighted the importance of community health workers and citizen involvement in peace building. So the main finding of this research is, shows that with proper support and coordination, community-led efforts can address gaps left in governance on issues of inequality and marginalization to transform violence reduction while achieving positive health outcomes in fragile, conflict-affected, and vulnerable settings. And ultimately, strengthening accountability, resource mobilization, and citizen engagement across national and local levels, it's more effective and at countering violence than good governance alone of community-based interventions. Third research is done by Layan on women's involvement in peace-building initiatives in Kenya. The research question is, how do patriarchal societal norms and political structures continue to limit women's role in peace-building and conflict resolution in Kenya? Despite all the international and local efforts to promote gender equality, women in Kenya continue to face limitations and challenges in playing a role in peace building and conflict resolution. So the patriarchal society norms and political structure restrict women's roles in spite of the women's historical and contemporary contributions in a lot of grassroots peace building initiatives and organizations. And integrating women will enhance the effectiveness of peace processes as they often bring unique and comprehensive perspective that lead to more successful and enduring peace agreements. It also promotes gender equality and aligns with international mandates such as the UN Security Council resolution, which requires the increased participation of women in peace efforts. And furthermore, women's involvement ensures that specific issues like gender-based violence and economic vulnerabilities are addressed in post-conflict settings. This participation not only leverage local knowledge through women's leadership in community initiatives like Barazas, and it address the barriers that limit women's roles in peace building. It can transform conflict resolution dynamics and contribute to a more inclusive and effective approach to peace and security in Kenya. So Layan's research showed the pivotal role that women play in peace building in Kenya. And particularly, she emphasized that there needs to be a paradigm shift that views women not just as victims of conflict, but as essential and proactive agents of peace. This transformation is very crucial for effective post-conflict reconstruction, development, because women's unique perspectives and holistic approaches to conflict resolution will enrich and sustain peace initiatives. So the findings argue that women's involvement in peace processes lead to more comprehensive and enduring solutions, challenging traditional competitive male-dominated conflict resolution method. By integrating women fully and effectively in peace-building efforts, not only do these efforts become more inclusive, but they also become more likely to yield long-lasting and effective outcomes. Last but not the least, my research, it's about the political clientelism in Kenya, the evolution of organized criminal gangs in electoral violence. So when we talk about Kenya, this is a country where the former president and the current president have both been indicted by the ICC. So this state, it's deeply criminalized. And so whenever election comes, the organized criminal gangs across the city start to fight with machetes, and in the rural area, they start to fight with guns. So this leads to my research question: how has the clientelism between politicians and organized criminal gangs led to persistent electoral violence? And how has this relationship transformed over time? Kenyan politicians have a very long history of supporting and funding organized criminal gangs to perpetrate electoral violence. The most notorious post-electoral violence in 2007 and 2008 almost pushed the country to a civil war. More than 1,200 people died, and 300,000 villagers were displaced. So it ended with the indictment of the political leaders at the SEC, but the charge was later dropped because of lack of evidence. And they use a militia called Mnginki to perpetrate all the electoral violence in 2007 and 2008. But despite the indictment and all the international attention, the electoral violence, which involved politicians utilizing those organized criminal gangs and militias, continue to happen in the subsequent elections in 2013, 2017, and 2022. So my research used the term organized criminal gangs as an umbrella term in line with the policy documents of Kenya, which don't differentiate between different armed groups like vigilant groups, mobs, ethnic militias, and party militias. So the literature on election and political violence often focus on traditional clientelism, which where the candidate will bribe the voters using exchanges such as jobs, money, promise of housing, food, and alcohol. It overlooked the intermediaries between the politicians and voters, some of which are the extra-state violent groups like the criminal gangs. So in the case of Kenya, the Afrobarometer data shows that overt material exchanges for votes, such as food, gifts, or money, are not so commonly reported in Kenya's elections. That is why I focus my research on the armed clientelism instead of the traditional clientelism. So my focus is how politicians collude with organized criminal gangs and militias to perpetrate the electoral violence. So 90% of the organized criminal gangs in Kenya have political links. They receive direct or indirect support from politicians in the form of combat training, funding, direct salaries, weapons, and economic control over the bus parks, market stalls, and business contracts. So in urban areas, especially Nairobi slums, the gangs, they also undertake roles of that typically reserved for state, but hasn't but wasn't in place because of the state's retrenchment of public services. So they provide security and all the public services like water and whatnot, where the government and law enforcement presence is very minimal. So my finding of the research is that the governance weaknesses in the form of political clientelism and outsourcing state violence can become a very self-perpetuating virtual cycle. So in post-independence Kenya, the party militias were initially formed for electoral purpose. But the political and socio-economic changes in the 1990s, including the multi-party elections and the structural adjustment programs of the IMF has led to a bunch of social and political challenges that lead to the organic emergence of gangs that initially formed along ethnic lines and fight for ethnic or community purpose, but they were later utilized by politicians in elections. And they also found new roles beyond elections and entrenched themselves in the informal and illicit economies, growing stronger and more autonomous within the clientelist networks. So these development increase the politicians' inclination to engage with these groups, further strengthening their role in politics. And the clientelism between the organized criminal gangs and politicians show that the persistence of criminal gangs in electoral violence are more influenced by political mobilization and the strategies chosen by the government instead of ethnicity or community identities. Finally, we have some joint recommendations for solving the social challenges in Kenya. First of all, the national and county government should allocate funds and coordinate more community-led security initiatives, such as the citizen participation in security and local peace community. And it should ensure the active participation of women and youth. Second, social welfare programs should be implemented at both the national and county level, targeting unemployed and underemployed youth, including implementing Kenya's Vision 2030's mandate to reserve 30% of public service positions for young people. The third recommendation is to provide targeted training for women and youth in strategic planning, community mobilization, and project management. The fourth recommendation is that Parliament and other government bodies should improve their accountability, for example, in enacting all the laws, regulating electoral campaign financing and on the organized criminal groups. The last recommendation, there should be an increasing collaboration between central and county governments and local communities to improve intelligence gathering on conflicts and violence, and also ensure adequate funding devolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. Thank you to all the presenters who've been remarkable in sticking to time and to the format, so we make this into a very efficient process. So now, as was announced, I'd like to give an opportunity to the audiences to engage with our students who have written these extensive reports to potentially detail some of the explanations that you have just heard. And I'm actually particularly glad to see Dr. Pashayan, who was one of our guest speakers during our pre-trip preparation phase. And if you don't mind, I would like to give you the opportunity to express your impression about what you've just heard and potentially ask questions to Dr. Pashayan.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm so impressed by all of you, all of your hard work. It's really shining right through. It looks like you had a wonderful experience. You learned a lot. I saw some of the things that I shared with you sort of sprinkled into your work. I'm really happy to see that. You know, I don't really have so many particular questions, but I do have something that I noticed in your recommendations. oftentimes we, as Westerners, we know what should be done, right? We feel that we know what should be done. And so I challenge all of you to think deeply about your position as a Westerner and how you live and the laws that you abide by and what you are recommending for a foreign country, right? They are a foreign country, which means they do things differently. So I challenge you to think a little bit more about, when you say you need good governance, how? How do you formulate good governance? What literal steps can you take to encourage a government to produce good governance? And so that's really the main thing that I would advise you going forward. I think that when you can sort of tweak and add in something like that, that's really a strong methodology to carry out gender equality or climate smart adaptation or mitigation. That's when people are like, you know what, I'm gonna hire you and I'm gonna double hire you because you've solved a problem. But I love everything you guys did and I really, really applaud you. You guys were just dead on with all of the issues. And I'm very, very proud, of each and every one of you. There was a flood just 2 days ago in Kenya, flooded out all of Mukuru slum. So, and the government's got a kind of bland thing of how they're gonna clean it up. And some of your work, whichever group did the climate work, you guys have some good things that would be very appropriate to the letter that I just saw. So I am duly impressed and keep up the good work.
Very much, Dr. Pashan. I see also Professor Joseph is with us, another veteran of conflict management. I would like to invite you also as Dr. Pashan to do some commenting and discussing what you just heard.
Sure. Thank you, Sanisha, and it's really great to be here. I'm going to tell you, in all honesty, those were some of the best and most serious presentations that I can remember by SAIS students in a long time. I mean that. Each of those was exacting, incredibly serious, each of them with, and I'm gonna have at the end one specific question for only one of the presenters. I apologize, I can't, but there's a myriad of questions that I could ask, but I have one specific one for one. And the other thing is I applaud the spirit as well. I listen, what I took away was that there was great empathy for an awareness of conditions and respect for Kenya, and that the impetus was from wanting to improve, where all countries are struggling. And in the United States, we sometimes even have observers come to this country. OSCE brings election observers and makes dozens of recommendations about it, including these most recent highly contentious elections. So no country is above outside scrutiny, and I think it's to your great credit that you went there and that you applied an intelligent and I think empathetic critique on my particular question. I could ask on each of them. I will focus on one because it centers on a recommendation. It's related to a recommendation that I made years ago. And I'll tell you, I had a short piece that was published on this in the New York Times after there was severe election violence in Kenya and in Pakistan, almost simultaneously, terrible violence. And I made a recommendation, and it had to do with Nick, that body, the
C.
yes, say the acronym again.
IEBC.
IEBC. And my suggestion, I wanted to ask Nick in particular about that, his suggestion and how you, if you could amplify and elaborate a little bit about that. Because I saw that entity in both countries as central to curbing and addressing the election violence, because I don't know if it's still the same, but in each country, that body was the one that promulgated the regulations through which the election process went awry, producing this terrible violence, meltdowns. And that if this body, my suggestion was that each of these, that these bodies should be certified by the UN. The UN has an election apparatus, they have experts, and it could be in the realm of the United Nations. Which then perpetuate the situation. So Nick, I was going to ask you if you could elaborate on how you see the centrality or not of that organization and your concept for reforms or the reforms that are underway in Kenya.
Sure. So I think the overarching problem, regardless of certification, regardless of capacity, everything, is that there's just not the buy-in from political leaders to allow it to do its job. You know, if it did everything by the book as far as it could on its own, the underlying issue remains that its authority is still vested in another body. It's vested in the National Assembly, which selects its commissioners. Without the commissioners, it has no authority to do anything on its own, has no authority to, redo boundaries, has no authority to conduct elections in any meaningful way. So all of these issues are lasting because there's an unwillingness in Kenyan politics to allow it the independence. It cannot fight for its own independence. It is a entity that is inferior to the executive, legislative, or judicial branches right now. It is not part of any of them, so therefore it is ignored by all of them. The issue that Emirhan wants to elaborate more is his expertise. By moving it to the judiciary, by allowing it that independence and that isolation from politics, the hope would become that the institution itself, the IEBC, would be able to, conduct its constitutional mandate on districts, on elections, without that political interference, but still with oversight and accountability from a branch of government. That's the key. You want to make sure that there's been a lot of issues in the commission with still being too close to politics and that commissioners end up in politics or vice versa. These are all ongoing issues. Hopefully by moving it to the judicial branch, by doubling down on the ethical standards that supervise it, you get to a point where its authority is not questioned or outright ignored in politics.
Emirhan, would you like to come to the podium because the cameras are not picking
Yes, sorry, I'm shooting away over here.
By all means, just to expand on the
Thank you for the question. Nick already explained quite a bit, but what I can add to that, electoral commissions and the problem regarding this institution is not new in Kenya. Before IEBC, there was an institution called Electoral Commission of Kenya, and their presidents, their commissioners were complaining all the time about the lack of authority and enforcement and the legal tools that actually allow them to conduct free and fair elections. So there you can find explanations of these previous commissioners about the elections 1 week before, and they are saying things like, we are not sure we are going to be able to conduct these elections free and fair because of this and these reasons. And this is an ongoing issue until 2010. Then after the constitutional change, they are designating a more independent body. But as Nick said, the independence of this body is lying on the parliament, and they can still control the IEBC by not appointing commissioners and or like if they are happy with the boundaries, existing boundaries, they are just appointing them quite a bit late, like 3 months before the elections or 5 months before the elections, and IABC remains unfunctional in those regards. Our suggestion is that if it can get a funding from the government, not with parliamentary approval, but a direct annual budget from Treasury. If it can select its election officers from the government officials, like public officials or like people who are working already in the judiciary, it can actually do a better job. Yeah, I can elaborate.
No, thank you very much. Thank you. To your satisfaction, and I'd like to invite others to now.
I'm gonna share my past
By all means.
recommendation. I'll send to Nick and Nick can share with you. I'll see if it's relevant.
Yes, please. Yes.
Isha, your research on health and conflict is really interesting. Having worked in South Asia for projects that are related with community health and social protection, it was always linked with this idea of women not having access to finance, and how community workers and health was so integral for that. It was mostly related to finance and reproductive health. And even at the World Bank meeting this year, there was this whole session on why Ministry of Finance have to start thinking about gender-based violence when they're developing their budget. But there was never a link about, like, you know, how health and this idea of conflict is so important. So I wanted to know if you could elaborate on that, because that is something I've never really thought of working as a development professional.
I would also like to invite Leon, who also focused on these issues, to kind of follow up.
Thanks, Asta. So yeah, per Kofi's point, part of the findings was that there's a gap in it. So like frameworks exist, concepts exist, words exist, but actual linkages to like, what does USAID's CERTI framework actually do? Or what is the public health initiative that, I just want to highlight a researcher in University of Nairobi for a second, then I'll come back to your point. So there is a researcher named Dr. Roseanne Njeru, and this is the study I referred to that looked at 2 informal settlements and the role of community health workers, most of whom are women, and how they were able to increase social cohesion, social bonds, but also there was already built-in trust for these women working at the community level versus government officials and other folks there. So I'll say this, so there's a gap in the literature, but there are small but effective cases known. The issue is, as many of the, much of the work has pointed out, is things that are community-led or community-based. There's often no track record to show this was effective, because no one's actually watching that, because there's not a kind of mechanism for accountability. But also a point that came up in a lot of folks' conclusion regarding resource mobilization. Like, money may exist at the national level, but does not get trickled down to the county level in Kenya, or it comes to the county level with no direction or no kind of, this is what the money is towards, and this is how it feeds up to the national level. I don't know if I answered your question. Let me know if I didn't, because I have a lot to say.
Lan, is there something you'd like to add? It's a broad topic as well, and you've been covering quite a lot.
I can add a couple of things. So I want to link it to the broader issue of, there's a rule in the Constitution which says that women have 2/3 of like a gender quota. And even with that rule, there's still a lot of impediments that actually allow for women to have their voice. So first of all, there's the implementation and enforcement. There isn't actually a law that says, oh, you have to implement this rule of the gender quota. So even with it, the voices aren't getting amplified. And there's also the political and social social resistance. It's mainly social and cultural norms. There's the issue of the perception of women. So in conflict, women are usually perceived as victims, and without separating that women are always victims and not as active agents of peacemakers, there's never going to be like an active push and a difference. So I think to reach that level of like the broader scope of health, there needs to be a realization of, okay, we have this rule of the 2/3 gender quota, but what can we do to actually give the voice and educate the women? You need to educate them about policy, negotiations, and all these other things that are grassroots for them to reach that point. Yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to.
Thank you. Cameras works. I'm gonna stay put so that I don't take the spotlight from the students. Yes, please.
Hi, amazing today and very informative as well. Thanks for having us. My question was regarding the climate finance portion. I just wanted to get a better idea of what's the size and composition of the Kenyan financial sector, and their then capacity to mobilize climate finance and finance in general. And then if you've been able to consider or think about how sovereign debt, the problem of sovereign debt impacts climate finance and vice versa, how climate finance could impact sovereign debt.
Share some insights.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the question. First off, as to the size, I think the latest numbers in 2020 were that Kenya, between public and private sectors and international and domestic capacities, had about 2.8 billion going to climate finance, but that includes mitigation and adaptation. I was obviously looking a bit more specifically at the adaptation angle, and I think mitigation gets a heavy portion of that funding. The 2.8 billion itself is about a third of what Kenya needs annually to meet its nationally determined contributions. So again, that's just the mitigation side, not even looking at adaptation. There's about a 50-50 split between public sector and private sector funding right now. And on that public sector funding, about 30% comes from the federal government itself. The other 20% comes from international players. Now, I didn't look specifically at your second question. The only thing I can say is that I was looking at the private sector side of things because I realized that the public sector domestic market in Kenya, combined with what aid they can get on the international level, is inherently going to be limited. So tapping those kind of carbon credit markets, public-private partnerships, other avenues that can kind of accelerate private finance on top of what's already available publicly might help to make up for that shortfall. But I appreciate the question, and I'll be sure to look into it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Other questions, please. I know that we have promised a feast after the event to incentivize everyone to join us. Just, you know, from this position, I'll take the opportunity to also explain the overall scope of the report once you've now heard most of the key insights and insights amount beyond what was possible to condense into these presentations. The idea really that led to this project was to unpack what really is the nexus between good governance and peace building overall. So these are two very broad themes that have been dominating the discourse in international affairs, but they're rarely met. For some absurd reason, they operated separately as if it was assumed that they are self-sufficient and that they don't need to interact. However, the Kenyan experience tells us that there is much to learn from their interaction, as every country can emulate to a certain degree the best practices that Kenya has to show for. So what we have seen, and this is something that will come out as a concluding kind of chapter in the report, that Angel and I are going to draft after all of the chapters are in, is that the need to rethink policies of peace building through the lenses of good governance actually tell us about the importance of the bottom-up approaches to peace building. The conventional wisdom of peace building is that it's a profoundly, primarily top-down approach. In liberal peace building paradigm, we think of conditionality that is targeted towards decision makers as the precursor for any form of transformative process that would lead a society to move into a functioning, thriving democracy. And this is on the decision makers, right? Now, all of the students went to Kenya and they started looking at, okay, if we put so much pressure on decision makers, how much can we actually trust that they will deliver on the expectation of the ultimate peace building? And we saw that relying primarily on these top-down approaches does not really allow for targeted outcomes to be achieved. So the bottom up that kind of emanates from all of the conclusions suggests that there is a parallel path, not an alternative path, but a parallel path to the traditional liberal peace building that we have been accustomed to for decades. And that every society has their own idiosyncratic approaches to bottom line policies that now in the Kenyan case can be traced in these four broad domains, all of them amounting to practices of good governance that are inspired by the feedback coming from bottom-up entities or bottom-up dynamics. So if we look at it, the future of peace building is in this kind of synchronous, if you want, interaction of top-down and bottom-up, which are not automatically in sync. They are oftentimes by design made to collide because priorities cannot be matched, because interests do not converge, because opportunities are limited. So now in the case of Kenya, we're seeing that on a very limited amount of policy domains, we actually see possibilities, opportunities, and good examples where this convergence was achieved, albeit limited, but that there is a path, there is a trajectory that we can detect. So this, for policy planning, for conceptual clarity, is a tremendous insight, because we're now learning that there are unfolding dynamics on how to improve peace building beyond external imposition and also beyond internal idiosyncrasies and attempts to improvise along the way, that there is an underlying logic that we can detect. And all of these papers have scrutinized that logic. And that's the power of this report, is that they brought together these combining paradigms of top-down and bottom-up approaches to peace building. The result is that they generate good governance. Maybe that is kind of tautological because good governance offers opportunities for peace building, and peace building creates good governance, so it kind of becomes cyclical. But it's in each of the papers, we actually see which one creates the causality, which one is independently operating and creates an outcome. And there are differences here at play. So once this is ready, cleaned up, polished, edited, tightened, and everything, it will be available publicly for everyone to read. And I really invite you to give a chance to this report, because it's a remarkable collection of insights that makes SAIS community at large very proud of their newly minted alumni in the making, if you want, in a few weeks' time. Professor Joseph.
Professor Vukovic, if you permit me, I can't resist this opportunity, a teachable moment. I teach in the skills realm. I teach 2 classes of policy writing, and I also teach applied strategic communications. And with our colleague, Professor Surwer, I also taught the conflict management, post-conflict stabilization transition. I want to convey, this is unrelated to the substance, but I cannot resist this opportunity about the slides. I just want to convey something, because this, in your professional, or if you advance academically, you may do, again, slide presentations. Again, these were excellent. They were serious. You were all poised, prepared, articulate. The one suggestion I will give you to make it even better on your slides, less is more. Too much information on the slides. And the two things will happen when you put too much information on the slides. Either the audience will not read the slides because it's too much information. Or what's the other thing? They will read the slides and they will not be listening to you. And so you see, you take the point. So you are the focus of any presentation, not your slides. You are the focus. The slides are to enhance your presentation. So sorry.
No worries. Thank you. That's a valuable
this
piece of advice. Absolutely. So with that in mind and everything that I've tried to kind of use as a synthesis of all the findings, please join me in congratulating the conflict management field trip to Kenya for a successful. Hopefully this will be inspirational for some of the first years among yourselves who will apply for next year's trip. You don't know where it's going to be. That is going to be revealed sometime in September. Until then, please join us in the catering that was provided to celebrate the success. Team, congratulations.
You almost did.
Oh,